Another method of data collection, that would be the testing method. So what do we mean by a test then? Well, if we see a test may be defined as a specific type of measuring instrument whose general characteristics is that it forces responses from a pupil, and the responses are considered to be indicative of the pupil's skill, knowledge, attitudes, etc. Now, some examples are true or false tests, essay examinations, attitude skills, short answer tests, midterms, finals, personality inventory, and a lot more. And there are classifications of tests for research as well. And as per classification of tests for research purposes, this is categorized into two types. First, we have according to standardization, and second, we have according to function. Now, in order for us to better understand each of these classifications, let us discuss them one by one, starting with according to standardization. Now, as you can see, the classification of tests for research purposes according to standardization is divided into two parts. First, we have standardized tests, and second, we have non-standardized tests. So what's the difference between the two? Well, if we say standardized test, standard or standardized test is one for which content has been selected and checked empirically, for which norms have been established, for which uniform methods of administration and scoring have been developed, and which may be scored with a high degree of objectivity. In addition, standard tests are usually prepared for very carefully by specialists following certain principles of test construction, given to a large number of individuals for the establishment of norms, and to be used for a long time with the group with which it is intended for. Examples of standardized tests, we have aptitude tests, personality tests, and interest inventories. Now, in order for us to better understand more about this, let me give you an example. So, for example, an intelligence test is made for high school students. The test may be used for a long time for high school students, but it cannot be used for other groups of people. Now, standard tests are especially useful in psychological studies. They are used to determine the personality characteristics of people, such as the intelligence, we have aptitudes, the interests of the people, achievement, mental abnormalities, etc. So they are useful, especially in individual case studies. And on the other hand, if we say non-standardized tests, as the name indicates, are not standardized. So they are usually prepared by teachers to measure the achievements of their students or pupils in the subjects they are teaching for marking and promotion purposes. Now, some examples of non-standard or teacher-made tests are essay examinations, objective tests such as true or false, fill in the blanks, multiple choice, matching, labeling, etc. And another classification of tests for research purposes is according to function. And according to function is divided into two types. First, we have psychological tests, and second, we have educational tests. Now, what's the difference between the two? If we say psychological test, this is a test that measures an individual's ability or personality as developed by general experience. So psychological tests are standardized, and the types of psychological tests are intelligence tests, aptitude tests, and personality tests as well. And under personality tests, we have rating scale, personality inventory, projective test, and vocational and professional interest inventory. Now, let us discuss first what an intelligence test is. So, if we say intelligence test, this is a composite test made of parts that have been found to correlate well with some practical measure of intellectual ability, such as success in school. And usually, this is called an IQ test, and it measures general mental ability. On the other hand, if we say aptitude test, this is a test designed to indicate a person's potential ability or performance of a certain type of activity. Examples are musical aptitude tests, prognostic tests, scholastic aptitude tests, mechanical aptitude tests, and the like. So this test measures special talent or ability. So that is why from the word itself, aptitude. And the last type of psychological test, that would be personality test. And if we say personality test, this is a test designed to measure some aspects of an individual's personality. And the types of personality tests are rating scale. And if it's a rating scale, it is a measure used in evaluating products, attitudes, or other characteristics of instructors or learners. So the usual form in an evaluation chart carrying some suggestive points for checking. On the other hand, we have personality inventory. And personality inventory is a measuring device for determining an individual's personal characteristics, such as his emotional adjustments rather, or tendencies toward introversion or extroversion. So it may be arranged for self-rating or for rating by other persons. Now, this test also measures dominance and submissiveness. And aside from that, we also have projective tests. And if it's a projective test, it is a method of measurement of an individual's personality in which the stimulus is usually unstructured and produces responses reflecting the person's individuality. So the Rorschach test consisting of ink blots is an example of projective test. Now the subject interprets the ink blots and his interpretations reveal his personality. And the thematic apperception test consisting of standardized pictures is another example. Here, the subject interprets the pictures and his interpretations will reveal his values, motives, and other aspects. And also we have vocational and professional interest inventory. And if we say vocational and professional interest inventory, this is a test used to determine the extent to which a person's likes and dislikes relate to a given vocation or profession. So this test reveals in what type of work a person is interested in, whether business, teaching, medicine, mechanic, etc. So if you were in your high school or right before you graduated your senior high school or grade 12, you were actually given a vocational and professional interest inventory test, because this is for you to determine which type of profession you are inclined into, okay? And finally, the last type of classification of tests for research according to function, that would be educational test. And if we say educational test, this is an achievement test which aims to measure a person's knowledge, skill, ability, understanding, and other outcomes in subjects taught in school. So therefore, this test may be standardized or teacher-made. So examples of educational tests are achievement tests in mathematics, English, science, etc. And aside from these classifications of tests, we also have characteristics of tests. So there are certain characteristics of a test without which the test may not be useful. So the characteristics of a good test are the following. So first, your test should have validity. So what do I mean by validity? If we say validity, it refers to how accurate a test measures what it aims to measure. This means to say that if a test aims to measure knowledge and proficiency in geometry, and it does measure knowledge and proficiency in geometry, then it is a valid test. However, if it measures knowledge and proficiency in algebra instead, then it is not valid. So some criteria to determine the validity of a test are: first, the test items are taken from the subject of the test. So, meaning to say, if the test is about geometry, then the items must be taken from geometry. And second criteria, it must correlate highly with a similar test of already known validity. And third, it must be able to predict performance of individuals in the same subject from which the test has been made. So this means, for instance, if a student gets only 80% in a standard geometry achievement test, then he is able to get the same rating in a test of similar nature in geometry. And finally, the test must be able to place an individual in a group to which he belongs to. Now, in order for us to better understand this, let me give you a sample scenario. So, for example, a standard geometry achievement test has norms for first, second, third, and fourth year high school students. If the test is given to all the high school students, the second year students score generally higher than the first year. The third year score generally higher than the second year, and the fourth year score generally higher than the third year students. And aside from validity, your test should have reliability characteristic as well. So if we say reliability, a test is considered reliable if it gives the same measurement to the same individuals or groups. That is, if the test is given twice to the same individuals or groups after the lapse of a certain period between the two administrations. For example, if a test is conducted and the mean is 75, and after a certain period, the same test is given to the same group and the mean is also 75, then the test is reliable. Also, if an individual obtains the same score or about the same score in second administration, the test is reliable still. Now, some factors that make a test more reliable are: first, we have adequacy. That is, the test is long enough to contain properly selected representative items of the behavior or knowledge to be measured. And the test items are proportionally picked out from the topics of the subject matter, which is the subject of the test. And second, we have objectivity. That is, a test paper will give the same score no matter who will score it, or scored by the same person at different times. Now, if a test is scored by Miss Ando and the score is 85, and that's scored by Miss Feria without knowing the score given by Miss Ando, and the score is also 85, then the test is objective. And finally, the procedures in administering the test must be the same whenever the test is given. So besides, the test must also be given under the same conditions of the room. And finally, the last characteristic that a test should have or should possess, that would be usability. So a test is considered usable if it is easy to administer, easy to score, economical or not expensive, and there are norms to compare the results with, and it is utile. That is, it is usable for the purpose it is intended to perform. Okay, so what are the advantages and limitations of a standardized test then? Well, the advantages of standardized tests: first, standardized tests are generally valid and reliable, which is actually correct. And second, standardized tests are accompanied by manual of instruction concerning their administration and scoring, And so there are no problems on how they are administered and scores because there are already standards given out as to how you check the test paper of the student, as to how it is being scored, and so on and so forth. And number three, standardized tests are provided with norms with which the test results are compared and given meaning. Hence, interpretation of test results is very easy. And number four, standardized tests can be used again and again, provided they are not given to the same group twice or more. So if they are given to the same group repeatedly, their validity and reliability will be adversely affected because of the effect of practice. Okay, take note about that. And number five, standardized test provides a comprehensive coverage of the basic knowledge, skills, abilities, and other traits that are generally considered as essential. So despite all of these advantages of a standardized test, we also have limitations of standardized tests. And one limitation is, first, since standard tests are intended for general use, their contents may not fully correspond to the expected outcomes of the instructional objectives of a particular school, course, or subject. So this is especially true with standard achievement tests, and therefore, very careful selection has to be done if standard tests are to be used for measurement. And second, since standardized tests are very objective, they may not be able to measure the ability to reason, explain, contrast, organize one's idea, and the like, because this is a standardized test, meaning you are not able to express more your opinion since this is not an essay type of test. Okay, so number three, standardized tests of the right kind for a purpose may be scarce and hard to find, which is actually true. And another method of data collection is what we call the registration method. So what do we mean by registration then? If we say registration, it is a process of listing down items of the same kind in some systematic manner for record purposes. Registered matter may be classified alphabetically, chronologically, qualitatively, quantitatively, or otherwise. So, for example, take the enrollment in a certain university or school, for instance. Now, the students may be listed down alphabetically, correct? Or if not, the students are listed down chronologically by year level as first year, second year, third year, or fourth year. Or the students can be listed qualitatively as well by course as BS Civil Engineering, BS Industrial Engineering, BS Electrical Engineering, BS Mechanical Engineering, etc., etc. Or the students may be listed down quantitatively by listing down first the course with the highest enrollment, followed by the course with the second highest enrollment, etc. So for the purpose of research, okay, the following are very rich sources of data or information under registration method. So under registration method, we can collect the information from the Bureau of Census and Statistics for almost all kinds of data about population, housing, industry, trade, etc. Or the Bureau of Census and Statistics, or what we call the NSA, or the National Statistics Authority as well. And another rich sources of data or information under registration method, that would be the Land Transportation Commission for all kinds of vehicles, such as cars, trucks, motorcycles, jeeps, etc. Or we have the LTO, or Land Transportation Office. Aside from that, we also have the Department of Education, Culture, and Sports, or the DEX, and its regional offices and schools, colleges, and universities, may it be public or private, where all enrollments and graduates are being recorded. And also we have the Supreme Court and all lower courts of justice where records of judicial cases are kept. And also we have all police agencies and offices where all criminal cases are recorded. And aside from that, we have the Bureau of Health or the Department of Health where all births, deaths, and pathological cases are being registered. And also we have the SEC or Securities and Exchange Commission where all trade, industrial, and commercial establishments and other organizations, profit or non-for-profit, are registered. And finally, we have all other departments, offices, and entities of the government and private organizations, entities or offices where different kinds and classes of data and information are being registered. All right, so these are examples of registration method. And aside from testing method and registration method, we also have what we call the interview method. So what is meant by interview then? Well, if we say interview, it is one of the major techniques in gathering data or information, and it is defined as a purposeful face-to-face relationship between two persons, one of whom called the interviewer, who asks questions to gather information, and the other called the interviewee or the respondent who supplies the information as for. So what are the different purposes and uses of the interview? Well, the researcher may use the interview in the following circumstances. First, the researcher may approach and interview knowledgeable people to enable him to gain insight into his problem, the variables he is going to use, the formulation of his specific questions and hypotheses, and the statistical methods he is going to utilize as well. So most likely, the researchers may approach their thesis advisors or any person who is knowledgeable in the making of a research paper. And second, the researcher may also interview knowledgeable people about the proper construction and validation of a questionnaire or who can make any contribution to the enrichment of his study. This means to say that the researchers should be able to find time to interview knowledgeable people. And when I say knowledgeable people, these are the people who, for example, who graduate master's studies or doctor's studies, okay? Because these people are inclined in doing researches. So they are knowledgeable enough to provide necessary information about the proper construction and validation of a certain questionnaire. And third, in cases when the subject of the study is a person with some signs of abnormality, then the interviewer may wish to gain information from the overt, oral, physical, and emotional reactions of the subject towards certain questions to be used for a possible remedy of the abnormality. And another purpose or use of interview, that would be the researcher may also use the interview as the principal tool in gathering data for his study. So these are the four purposes and uses of the interview. Now, what are the advantages of the interview then? Now, one advantage of the interview is that it yields a more complete and valid information. What do we mean by this? If we say yields a more complete and valid information, the respondent is usually pressed for an answer to a question which the interviewer can validate at once. So, for example, he can probe into the veracity of the reply immediately, and hence there is a higher proportion of usable returns. And another advantage of the interview can be used with all kinds of people, whether literate or illiterate, rich or poor, laborer or capitalist, etc. And number three, the interviewer can always clarify points or questions which are vague to the interviewee. So If in any case, the interviewee finds the question very hard to understand because it's very vague or unclear, then the interviewer can always clarify, okay? As much as possible, the interviewer should provide explanation to what the question or what he or she is really trying to ask. And number four, only the interviewee respondent can make replies to questions of the interviewer. Unlike in the case of a questionnaire in which filling up a questionnaire may be delegated to another person or the respondent may be aided by another person in making replies. And number five, the interviewer can observe the nonverbal reactions or behavior of the respondent, which may reveal rich, pertinent information. Now, these are called subliminal cues, which are behavioral or attitudes that are not specifically stated but are covertly displayed. So, what do we mean by this? These subliminal cues includes inflection in the voice, manner of speech, such as how hesitant the speakers are and how much enthusiasm they display when they speak, manner in which they sit on a chair, okay? This is also considered a subliminal cue. Activities such as frowns, movements of the head and hands. We also have statements they make when people are around and hesitancy in answering certain questions. And finally, their eagerness to talk about certain subjects while ignoring others. And therefore, the interviewer must be skillful in reading these subliminal cues. So he may bring such subliminal cues to the attention of the respondent to check if his suspected recognition is correct and to alleviate tension as well. Now, interpretations and predictions based upon nonverbal cues must be accurate. Otherwise, they will tend to be biased subjective data. And another advantage of interview is greater complex questions can be asked with the interviewer around to explain things. Greater complex data, which are vital to the study, can be acquired. And finally, there is also flexibility in interview, meaning the interviewer can effect a modification of the interview or any question if there is a need so that the desired information can be gathered. Now, despite these advantages of an interview, there are also disadvantages of the interview. And one disadvantage of interview is that sometimes selected respondents are hard to contact or cannot be contacted at all because of the distance of their place or due to some other reasons. For instance, if a selected respondent is in another country, then of course, it can be very hard to contact him, right? And second disadvantage, it is expensive if many interviewers have to be employed to meet a target date, which is actually true because the cost of training them and their salaries would entail too much expense. And third, the responses may be inaccurate if the interviewee has no time to consult his records, especially if the needed data involve numerals, okay? And number four, it is time consuming if only the researcher conducts the interviews, which is actually correct, especially if there is only, let's say, one or two researchers. So it would really entail a lot of time. And number five, it is inconvenient for both the interviewer and the interviewee in terms of time and sometimes in terms of place. So the interviewer has to travel distances. And once you travel from point A to point B or destination A to destination B, then it entails transportation costs as well. So that makes it very expensive. And number six, there is no anonymity. And so the interviewee may withhold some confidential but vital information, especially if the information may possibly invite trouble, which happens a lot of time. Now, this is true if the information is about, let's say, the morality of an individual or maybe the commission of graft or corruption. And number seven, there is a tendency of interviewers to introduce bias because they may influence their interviewees to give replies that would favor the researcher employers. Now, this may happen in political surveys where the candidacy of a certain person is being involved. Okay. And number 8, if the interviewer modifies a question, the standardized construction of the question is lessened and categorization and tabulation become a problem. All right, so these are the 8 disadvantages of the interview. So moving on to the types and classes of the interview. Now, according to Cheese and Cheese Jr., they classify interviews as standardized interview, non-standardized interview, semi-standardized interview, focused interview, and we also have non-directive interview. Now, in order for us to better understand each of these, let us discuss them one by one, starting with standardized interview. So what do we mean by standardized interview then? In this type of interview, the interviewer is not allowed to change the specific wordings of the questions in the interview schedule. So if you have an interview's questions, you have already prepared, or there is already a standard question to that particular interview schedule. And so for that matter, the interviewer are not allowed to change the wordings in that interview schedule. So whatever is written there, that should be the words that should be verbatimly said by the interviewer. So he must conduct all interviews in precisely the same manner, and he cannot adapt questions for specific situations or pursue statements in order to add something to the data. So this is the same as the so-called formal interview. On the other hand, if we say non-standardized interviews, in this type, the interviewer has complete freedom to develop each interview in the most appropriate manner for each situation. Now, in this case, the interviewer is not held to any specific question, meaning he may revise, add to, or subtract from the interview schedule that which he thinks is best for the situation. So this is the same as the so-called informal interview. On the other hand, for a standardized interview, here, the interviewer is required to ask a number of specific nature questions, and beyond this, he is free to probe he chooses. So there are prepared principal questions already be asked, and once these are asked and answered, the interviewer is free to ask any question as he sees fit for the situation. So in short, semi-standardized interview is a combination of standardized and non-standardized interview. And if we say focused interview, this is also known as depth interview. Why depth interview? Because this is similar to the non-standardized interview, in which no required question should be asked by the interviewer. In other words, the researcher asks a series of questions based on his previous understanding and insight of the situation. So specific attention is given to specific topics or ideas. And here, the interview is focused on specific topics that are to be investigated in depth. Okay, so the interviewer is therefore able to direct his questioning to discover the kinds of backgrounds and experiences that have influenced the subject. In counseling, for example, this is called directive counseling or directive questioning, to probe to the motives, experiences, and even problems of the counselee. And finally, the last type or class of interview is called non-directive interview. Now, in this type of interview, the interviewee or subject is allowed and even encouraged to express his feelings without fear of disapproval. The subject can express his feelings or views on certain topics, even without waiting to be questioned or even without pressure from the interviewer. In short, the interviewee does most of the talking. For example, the clinical interview used in psychotherapy is an example of non-directive interview. Here, the purpose of the non-directive interview is to get a comprehensive picture of the motives, values, and thoughts of subject or interviewee. And the problem here is how to make the interview talk. And another problem is that the question asked influences his point of view. Now, Mel and Medell classify interview as structured, semi-structured, and unstructured interview. Now, structured interview, according to them, is the same as standardized interview, as explained earlier. And the semi-structured interview is almost the same as the semi-standardized interview, and the unstructured interview is similar to non-standardized or non-directive interview. So, on the other hand, Good and Skates classify interview as according to function, and according to function includes diagnostic interview too, treatment interview, and research interview. And also, we have according to the number of persons participating, and it includes individual interview and group interview. So the group interview, here, several persons are interviewed simultaneously by the same interviewer. And another, we have according to the list of contact. So it includes short contact interview, long and contact interview. And finally, according to the roles And finally, according to the roles assumed by the interviewer and the interviewee in relation to the socio-psychological process of interaction. And this includes non-directive interview. And if you say non-directive interview, it includes uncontrolled, unguided, and unstructured. On the other hand, focused interview includes directive interview. And finally, repeated interview. This is done to trace development of a social or socio-psychological process, such as following the progressive reactions of a voter and making up his mind as to choice in a presidential election. So, in conducting our interview, what are the interview instruments then that the interviewer should be using? Okay, so there are two types of interview instruments. We have interview the schedule and the interview guide as well. So, what's the difference between the two? If we say the interview schedule, it's the same as the questionnaire. Okay, so the procedure of preparing and validating an interview schedule are the same as those of preparing and validating a questionnaire. The only difference between an interview schedule and a questionnaire is that in the former, the question is read to the respondent for him to answer, and his reply is written by the interviewer. And in the latter, the respondent himself reads and fills out the questionnaire alone without the aid of the researcher. Another instrument that is used during interview, that would be the interview guide. So what is meant by interview guide then? Well, an interview guide does not go into details, but it only provides ideas and allows the interviewer to freely pursue relevant topics. So the items provide for flexibility in the manner, order, and the language of questioning. Now, the interview schedule is used when the researcher knows all the items to be included in the interview about the hypothesis or specific questions. On the other hand, the interview guide is used when the researcher has a limited knowledge or information about the topics to be researched on, so that he needs more probing for an in-depth investigation. So how does an interview guide would look like then? Well, an interview guide normally includes the name of the interviewee or the one that is being conducted with an interview with. Okay, so this refers to the name of our respondent. It also includes the address and the date as to when the interview was conducted. So what are the other elements that should be included in an interview guide? So supposing your research problem is to determine the status of teaching science in the high schools of Province A during the school year 1989 to 1990, then you need to include the educational qualifications of the faculty or the science teacher, the methods and strategies of teaching, the facilities, the supervisory assistance, problems encountered in teaching, the proposed solutions to problems, and the implications to the teaching of science as well. So most likely, the elements or the items to be included in the interview guide are the things that can be found in your specific questions. I'm referring to your specific statements of the problem. All right, so these are the two interview instruments that we will be using. We have the interview schedule, and second, we have the interview guide. So what are the steps in the interview then, or the pointers in interview? Well, the steps or pointers to be followed in interview are as follows. First, we have the planning step, or also known as the preparatory step. Included in this step are selection of the universe and the locale of the study, okay? And second, selection of the respondents by any valid sampling method, which will be discussed later on. And also, selection of the type of interview as well, whether standardized, non-standardized, semi-standardized, focused, non-directive, etc., depending upon the nature of the problem or the topic of your research. And finally, it also includes the preparation of the instrument, whether interview schedule or interview guide, and validating or pre-testing the same. And the second step in the interview is selecting the place of the interview. So for guidance and counseling, as well as psychiatric interviews, the interviewer can select a very ideal place for the interview. However, in research in general, the interviewer may be required to go to the dwelling places of the interviewees or to their places of work. So if you are the interviewer, then you will be most likely invited by your respondent to their most convenient location or place as to when they would have the interview be conducted. But the important point is that the place of the interview should be as quiet and as convenient as possible with the least possible distractions. Okay. And third, establishing rapport. What do we mean by this? Well, a cordial and friendly atmosphere must be established between the interviewer and the interviewee. So the interviewer must introduce himself and his purpose as cordially and politely as possible. And you, being the interviewer, if you have an identification card, then you need to present your ID and show it to your interviewee. The importance of the interview to both the interviewer and interviewee must be impressed upon the latter. So the latter may have some benefit from the interview or study, or if there is none, then he must have the assurance that no harm may befall him. So it must be explained to your interviewee as well that the information he will supply will be kept as confidential as possible, and there will be a complete anonymity for him. So he must be assured rather that nothing will place him in any compromising or embarrassing situation. And the fourth step in the interview is carrying out the interview. What I mean about this is that you need to carry out the actual interview in a polite, friendly, and conversational manner. So as much as possible, you should sound conversational. You should avoid sounding scripted, okay? So also, you need to praise and thank the respondent for any important or vital comment worthy of mention. So if respondent is unable to express himself for lack of knowledge or for some technical terms, then the interviewer may help him out, but take note that the interviewer must maintain his objectivity. And aside from that, the interviewer must also be very tactful, meaning if the interviewee exhibits some signs of, let's say, annoyance or hostility, then the interviewer must use all his resourcefulness to quiet down the nerves of the respondent to make him cooperative again. So if he refuses to answer, then do not press him hard to make one. Just simply wait a little, or a little later, he may give in, and explain to him that any information he may give will be kept strictly confidential. And number 5, recording the interview. So as much as possible, you record the interview immediately but objectively. So record exactly what's been said by the respondent or any of his non-verbal expressions shown overtly, but do not write the interpretation as of yet. Example, write, he smiled, not he was pleased. Okay, so much the better if the interview is tape recorded or videotaped. So if you are recording the interview via a tape recording or video tape, then you need to get the consent first of your interviewee or respondents. Okay. And number 6, closing the interview. So you need to close the interview with an expression of gratitude, of course, and thankfulness for the information obtained and the time sacrificed by your interviewee, and make him feel that he has played an important part in the completion of your study. So what are the things that we should need to avoid during interviews? Well, there are things that may spoil an interview and should be avoided. Among these are, first, avoid exerting undue pressure upon a respondent to make him participate in an interview. Why is that? Because a respondent who is pressured hard to participate cannot be expected to freely give reliable information. And second, you should also try to avoid disagreeing or arguing with or contradicting your respondent. Why? Because this may irritate him, and as a result, he may not give some vital information for fear of being contradicted, right? And third, you should also avoid unduly pressing the respondent to make him a reply, because if you do so, he may give an inaccurate answer just to comply. So as much as possible, just wait for your respondent to answer. Do not press him to answer right away, okay? And number 4, avoid using a language well over and above the ability of the respondent to understand. What do we mean by this? Okay, so what I mean about this is that if the respondent does not understand very well the language of the interviewer, then the former may give wrong information or he may not respond at all. So, meaning, as much as possible, use very simple words that are easily understandable by the interviewees or your respondents. And number 5, avoid talking about irrelevant matters because talking too much about irrelevant things will only prolong the interview. So it is a waste of time on the part of the interviewer and on the interviewee who may become impatient because he has some important matters to attend to. And number 6, we should also try to avoid placing the interviewee in embarrassing situations. For example, delicate things should be handled with care, especially if the topic about is, let's say, morality, integrity, or even sexual habits. So avoid irritating sore spots, okay, if that makes sense. And number 7, avoid appearing too high above the respondent in education, knowledge, and social status. So this will make the interviewee very shy and timid, and rapport may not be established. So avoid being too erudite. So in simple words, in number 7, you should not try to be superior to your respondents in terms of education or knowledge. Okay. And finally, for number 8, avoid interviewing the respondent in an unholy hour. This means that you should avoid this, especially when he is too busy attending to an important matter, or when he is hungry, or when he needs to take a rest or take a nap. So, in other words, for number 8, as much as possible, you should comply to the most convenient time of the respondents as to when he or she is available to be interviewed. Okay.